The Cloud Theory of Economics by Matthew P. Holbert. What is happening to economy is what is happening to the nations and people of the world. Evolution of economy is such that it is gradually dissolving into a more pluralistic view. That is to say that economy and governments of the world are democratizing and decentralizing in such a way that a new phase in economic concepts is on the verge of emerging on the planetary scale. In order to clarify this theory, an explanation of the process, historically speaking, is necessary. However, to make this evolutionary process more understandable and make sense to more people, the use of a metaphor is essential. Also, it must be understood that this is an explanation of industrial economy, not of classical mercantile economics. Therefore, we begin with the utilitarian model. Imagine a sphere of ice, whole and unitary. It represents a utilitarian philosophy of capitalist economics. This view is that cold capital, machines, and other raw materials represent value. This can be clearly understood with a cursory examination of history. The iron and steel used to push us into the great industrial age is what we must base the value of our economy upon. This ice-cold sphere of raw material then breaks up into a more globalist mass through centralized banking. The bank, acting as an engine of economic growth, also acted as a ministry of value and an industry whose sole function it was to produce value, to create money, and in a sense to unleash the floodgates. Eventually this flood of credit would drown the lower classes and stand to drown even the middle class in debt. Today, this is consisting of fractional reserve liquidity, with many central banks and their corporations and nation-states dictating the general environment of economics, both exteriorly and interiorly, by way of capital investment and education respectively. This new stage is characterized by a more and more cash and credit-based system that the previous utilitarian model could not use. By doing so, this system relies less and less on cold, hard material for its basis of value, like gold and silver or industrial capital, and the value of money begins to be more and more based on the arbitrary command of central banks. As a consequence of uncertainty due to inflated credit and debased education, the world is heating up, not just literally, but figuratively, and as industry, and more importantly information, make the world more and more global, the tide of conflicts inspired by imperialism and corporate greed begin to rise past the watermark, and the world is also feeling the birth pangs of a new global economy, one which must be more evolved than its current form to handle the demand of democratic systems. The character of this new economy, which will inevitably replace capitalism as an economic premise, will likely bear characteristics of an intangible cloud. Accordingly, as this evolution of our perception of wealth transpires, it appears to have become less solid, less rigid, and more flexible with its liquidity. But as our technology evolves, so too does our economic potentiality. Like ice melting, economy has become far more liquid in recent times, more cash-based, more credit-based, and its abundance and uncertainty has reached a point where the liquid medium of cash has been replaced with more digital currencies, which have been called cloud currency. However, by my definition, this is only a vapor currency, as cloud currency is implied with citizenship, as I will explain below. To sum up the above, where we started with a sphere of ice, we now have a glob of water, which is slowly turning into a gas, which is the beginnings of a forming cloud. This cloud-like form of economy can only be cashless and without restrictions such as taxation and the barriers of rent, loans, dividends, interests, banks, and other such methods of control and usury by financial institutions. In the cloud, the means of exchange is intangible, unquantifiable human will, exercised in the form of labor, goods, services, or ecological and human benefit, and not in the form of a liquidity, cash or money. When our work and respect is shared collectively rather than hoarded individually, we can live without requiring proof of certification that our needs are worth fulfilling. Further, the process of exchange can be instantaneous between individuals because in a democracy, every contributing member, by merit of their requested citizenship and by virtue of their contribution to society at every varying degree of their contribution, will make them capable of simply walking into a store and taking what they need, such as foodstuffs, clothing, and available shelter, as an earned right. However, luxury goods will be limited to a person's contributing value to a society as a privilege. Furthermore, the profit motive, by virtue of this new dimensionality to economy, must be reversed into the direction of getting in equal measure to what you give, rather than getting more than you give, which is the commonly understood impetus of the current definition of profit motive. The author calls this a reciprocal economy because of the reciprocal nature of that economic driver, which is the essential foundation of all economy, human will. Further, the profit motive, by virtue of this new dimensionality to economy, must be reversed into the direction of getting in equal measure to what you give, rather than getting more than you give, which is the commonly understood impetus of the current definition of profit motive. The author calls this a reciprocal economy because of the reciprocal nature of the economic driver, which is the essential foundation of all economy, human will. Notice, however, that a cloud-like economy has elements of both capitalism and socialism, but does not have the power or potential for the top-down approach of either. It can and must be a grassroots approach, bottom-up approach, because as water or liquidity evaporates, so too the bonds that have kept the mass of human will together break down from monarchy to republic to democracy. What we are experiencing with this kind of flow from rigid solidity to liquid flexibility to gaseous intangibility is the development of a broader consciousness that is far headier and more evidently fractal in nature than the previous forms. Also, just as the cloud can more effectively allocate its liquidity to the surface of the earth than a ball of ice or glob of water, this new economic structure, transcending and including the previous forms, will have characteristics of holism, human-scale economics, and economic self-sufficiency due to its inherent grassroots scale. Bear in mind, however, that this cloud cannot stay in the sky forever. It must be balanced by first condensing into globs, then falling, turning into ice, then globs of water again, and ultimately returning to the earth at semi-regular intervals for the cycle to be completed and to keep the cycle of wealth and resources recirculating. The following is an explanation of the process of how this cloud-like economy will function, but it must be understood that this is only a simple projection because every local area must come up with their own model. I feel it should be left up to the future democracies to better develop and organize this method. Starting as a cloud of individual droplets of human will or the aggregate society or local community, and further condensing those individual droplets into globs of human will in the form of resource councils or test groups. The beginning of this cycle will occur in the form of stakeholder councils, or what has been called wisdom councils by a man named Jim Ruff, where products, services, and acts of benefit will be evaluated and cold capital resources will then be administered from that group of randomly selected people, much like product test groups, wherein the purpose of these groups is to evaluate and assign a value to products, goods, services, and certain ecological or human benefit created by a person. The products that fall under certain categories of goods will therefore be evaluated by licensing corporations as they function today. And finally, the people themselves to determine if they are worth investing in the next quarter. Such groups will evaluate and expect to administer resources for products that they unanimously decide are fit for production, much like a product test group or a trial phase of invention and production. And then after 4 months, these groups will disperse and a new group will be randomly selected. In the cycle mentioned above, the transfer of energy or currency or capital goes thus. Collective society, the cloud, differentiated group or wisdom council is a glob of water, and allocated capital, like an ice crystal, is then what is distributed through businesses, jobs, and labor working that capital into production, which is another glob of water. And once a product reaches consumers, it has reached the collective society, and it is left up to the collective will of that society, and therefore returns to the ocean or cloud, depending upon which way you wake up in the bed that morning. So, in this way, each time a group is brought together, they are like a small glob of human will out of the cloud, which is the aggregate economy, composed only of the essence of all economic principles, human will. And the feedback loop between production and consumption in a human scale of economics. And with every drop of resources allocated, these wisdom councils are keeping the cycle of life, wealth, and the feedback loop between production and consumption in a human scale economics. It is possible that these groups or councils could become themselves differentiated and that they may become specific to a field such as art, engineering, food, education, entertainment, news media, design, fashion, transportation, science, etc. And by having people who are specifically interested in a field of evaluation, there is a greater potential for a more meritocratic form of councils than simply random selection. However, this is a stipulation that can come about organically or by written constitution. What is most important is that people have control over their goods and services rather than a Wall Street market that has gotten more and more out of control and more uncertain. If wisdom is defined as seeing beyond immediate appearances and acting with a greater understanding to affirm the life and development of all, as Tom Atlee describes in The Tao of Democracy, then perspective offers wisdom. Therefore, communities have greater potential for wisdom than do individuals. Communities are wise, he explains further, to the extent that they use diversity well in cooperative, creative interplay of viewpoints that allows the wisest, most comprehensive, and powerful truths to emerge. Using co-intelligence, described by Atlee as integrating the diverse gifts of all for the benefit of all, and a technique called dynamic facilitation to replace mutual stuckness with common wisdom, described by business consultant Jim Ruff, author of Society's Breakthrough, Releasing Essential Wisdom and Virtue in All the People. We might have the tools necessary to evolve the founder's revolutionary vision and step into the 21st century with a collaboration-based system rooted in interdependence and mutual respect. According to Ruff, dynamic facilitation can provide a non-judgmental, heartfelt, energy-driven, creative thinking process in which the people seek to invent new options that work for everyone. Instead of negotiating agreement on particular points or discussing ideas back and forth, people seek breakthroughs everyone can support. To quote Bruce H. Lipton, PhD, in his book Spontaneous Evolution, in regards to such councils making governmental decisions and perhaps just as easily resource management decisions, quote, while such councils have the inferred power of moral authority and could recommend new solutions to the public, they do not possess coercive powers associated with the authority to pass legislation. And further, that regardless of the level of government or community in which they are used, such councils and their evolutionary principles offer society a vision of what is a healed body politic. While I am sure that most economists reading this fail to understand the implication, connection, and relevance of the above quotations and names which I have invoked, seeing as how these men are not economists and not members of the Old Boy Network, it is for this very reason that these voices are so important, necessary in our time. It was Einstein who said, "We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking when we created them."